Hola Pablo,
Hola, ¿qué tal, Pedro? ¿Cómo estás, querido?
muy bien, ¿y tú?
Todo muy bien, todo excelente, la verdad, no me puedo quejar.
Buenísimo, oye, mil gracias por unirte.
No, a ti, gracias por esta invitación.
Felices, creo que, digamos, de nuestra llamada fue tan interesante que dije va a tener bastante valor para el resto de los miembros.
Espero que sí. O sea, yo le voy a dar aquí mi mejor intento.
Buenísimo. Una duda, Pablo, ¿te animarías a hacerlo en inglés? Tenemos varios miembros de otros lados, entonces,
No hay
para
ningún
que
problema.
se entienda.
Sounds good to me.
Perfecto. Como igual se va grabando, yo creo que vamos comenzando, si quieres.
De una, de una, de una. So
Buenísimo.
let's switch gears.
Let's switch gears. So, thank you everyone for joining. This is Landa Talks number 4 with our special guest Pablo Freund. The idea of this talk is to bring in consultants that are a little bit further on their journey, and uh, they can tell us a little bit about their journey, the tips and trips of the trade, and any useful advice. So welcome again, Pablo, and maybe a good place to start is if you could tell us a bit about your background, your career, that'd be very interesting.
Thanks, Pedro. Thanks. I'm glad to be here and certainly happy to share a little bit about how I got started. Um, I started my undergrad uh, at Brown University, actually, in with the full intent of following a mechanical engineering track that would later allow a specialization in aerospace engineering. But my plans kind of changed when I halfway through that I actually decided that it was way more interesting for me to start pursuing other courses of study, and my university actually allowed me to switch directions. I ended up graduating with a double major in art history and economics, and I never stopped taking engineering classes up to my last semester. So that kind of set me up for what the rest of my career would be. I discovered very quickly that I was a generalist at heart, and then I spent a lot of time becoming a generalist by design. So after university, I I started working in finance and working in investments, actually covering a wide range of products and completely different market circumstances. Uh, I left college all starry-eyed about joining the financial industry, only to head right into the 2008 meltdown, very early in my career. So uh, I went from becoming what I thought was a financial professional to a fireman, putting fires out every day and just trying to figure out how to navigate these extremely rapidly changing conditions, and more importantly, uh, the all the theory that you learn to work in finance goes out the window when there's a meltdown of that magnitude. And portfolio theory that teaches us to diversify because that helps us spread risk kind of also goes out the window, because in a time of an extreme crisis, all of the assets become correlated. So I spent my time navigating banking in different roles until in 2011 I went back to grad school. I originally started working during the day and doing my master's at Columbia in sustainability management at night. But about a year went into that, and I realized that it was gonna take a really long time to finish my studies if I kept splitting my time. Um, but the idea actually in pursuing a degree in sustainability was that it could allow me to go back to that same academic spirit that I had in my undergrad, which was to pursue a lot of different interests. And so the field of sustainability integrates finance, energy, engineering, recycling, earth sciences, many different types of fields. So that's where I felt most at home, in this environment where you have to know one thing for one class and then something completely different for another. And when I left graduate school, I actually started working for an organization based in Brooklyn called the Buckminster Fuller Institute that had a cash prize for solutions that could solve global problems. And I found myself for a couple of years sitting there evaluating proposals from all the different types of problems you can imagine, from plastic waste in the oceans to how to harvest moisture from the dry air of the desert so that people could have drinking water in the arid climate. And after a couple of years of doing that, I also realized that the difference between them and me was that I was sitting in my office judging them, and they were out in the world doing stuff. So I actually decided to take a stab and do that myself. And in 2014, with a friend of mine, I co-founded a social enterprise called Be Girl that provides menstrual hygiene products in the developing world. And that was really designed with one theory behind it. All of the things that I like in terms of solutions are, where do you make the most minimal change in the point of highest leverage to achieve the biggest impact? And in the case of menstrual hygiene products, that meant keeping girls in school, and that would have an enormous effect over the life of that person. And so I worked on that for several years, and then we moved the company to Mozambique. And at that point, we had built a big supply chain and distributed in 25 different countries and done all sorts of things. And I had come to my kind of end of the road in working in that company. So I left my role management in my startup. It's still running. I'm just not running it. And that's when I started my consulting practice, which kind of integrated all of the different fields that I had been working in: gender, finance, energy, and sustainability.
That's amazing. Thanks for going into detail, and I think the background is really important for what we will be covering. So I guess switching to consulting, I know you're very passionate about it. So how did you get started? Usually we start with how did you get your first client, your first engagement, but feel free to walk us through what that looked like, that transition.
Yeah, the transition was really interesting because I think I got my started at consulting quite accidentally. I started looking for different opportunities, and one of my professors at school had been offered a position with the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, but she had a consulting firm, and she couldn't really do both at the time, but she had a lot of open work going on. So before she left, she introduced me to her partner and said, why don't you speak to her and maybe you guys can work together? And when I spoke to her, a good friend of mine now, we realized that we had been at the same school in undergrad and at the same school during grad school and had never met each other, but just had these very parallel lives, and ended up working, doing really interesting technical work for rural electrification programs in Africa. So my first project was really looking at the cost-benefit analysis, whether one government should build out a ton of small village-level mini-grids versus building out large power lines across the country and distributing power centrally. And what we did for that project was we developed a really interesting Excel model that modeled the statistical village, and then it modeled energy enterprise that sold power to that statistical village with random number generators. And then we actually ran that simulation about 500,000 times and built out a Monte Carlo simulation, and actually came to the conclusion that 80% of those energy enterprises would go bankrupt if they had to operate, which kind of put us into that map. And that project, I like it, and I share the technicals of, or the details of that project, because it kind of speaks to the fact that I was bringing in techniques that are used in finance, like Monte Carlo simulations, to kind of figure out where your portfolio might look like in a couple of years. But we applied it to a rural electrification program in Africa. Yeah.
Yeah, that's super interesting. And I think we can actually double click on that. I know you take on all sorts of different types of projects, and that's fascinating. I mean, and you integrate your different skills. So that's kind of rare for many consultants, and we actually promote like niching down to what you're really good at. So I was curious about if you could speak about being a generalist consultant and the pros, the cons. What has your experience been like?
I mean, I am a generalist, but I think it's unavoidable to do the niche work, because you know, that's where you get a lot of your referrals, and word of mouth is the best thing that can happen for consultants. However, I think the issue of being a generalist comes down to personal philosophy. I believe really deeply in the fact that there are so many specialists that some of the ways that I can add the most value is to find crossovers from different fields. And sometimes it's really worth thinking about how a lot of our knowledge has formed, and like kind of modern scientific knowledge is about people that observed a special case and managed to generalize that into a universal principle. And I think that there's so much knowledge that is lost because there's not enough cross-pollination of different fields. And I'll give you an example that just happened to me last week. I spoke in the morning to someone who called me up and said, I have a problem. I have a machine that's made to deliver feed for animals. And the feed is held in like these pellets. And I can't seem to get the right amount of flow from my machine. And he said, can you help me? And I said, look, I don't do that kind of work, but let me think about it. And later in the day, it just kind of hit me like a ton of bricks that I know someone who worked on efficient burners for pellet stoves. And I realized it's probably the same problem. Like one just feeds a furnace, the other one feeds animals, but it's the same principle. So if you think about what happens as a consultant, many times, you're looking at the same problem in a different field. And that's what happens to me very often. I've worked on issues of access to finance and issues of access to electricity. They seem completely unrelated. And yet the way that the international financial flows work with the multilateral development banks, the way that surveys or the statistics that are used to measure them are collected are very similar. And it's actually just kind of like switching a track. But the knowledge that you're that you have formed is still quite applicable, even if you're not a technical specialist about engineering issues in energy. It really doesn't mean that you can't add value to that situation. So that's generally my approach, and I do have, I don't know if it's built out of necessity or out of choice, but the way I tend to go into any problem-solving situation is really the listening mode. If I'm doing more than 20% of the talking, then I'm getting it really, really wrong when I'm trying to understand what a client needs. And I think that half the time, I feel like my job as a consultant is to ask better questions.
Actually, do you mind double clicking on that last part?
Yeah, it's a weird way. Consultants sometimes play this dual role of problem solver / therapist. Your client is telling you all the things that are not working, and I think as a consultant and being brought in to problem solve, there's a very powerful instinct to go into problem solving mode quickly. And I often think that many problems are in the way that the client might name them for you, they're only symptoms. And if you treat the symptoms, you might not treat the problem. And so that's why I think it's really important to keep digging until you can really get to a core and a source of the problem, source of the symptoms. And then I think that means getting skilled at listening, which is the skill that's developed. Some are better listeners than others. I was not a good listener. I've had to work on it. I've also had to work on curbing that impulse of jumping into problem solving mode so that I don't end up spending my energy on something that's not really a problem, but a symptom. And that's what I really mean by you have to get good at asking questions. And half the time, by asking more questions, your client will provide you more information and their instinct of where the core problem lies. So I do think if you're working in a customer, like in a client-facing consulting, I think a lot has to do with actually demonstrating to your clients that you hear them about what they need solved, but you are willing to go that extra step in the diagnostic. And many times that actually opens up some additional project possibility. You might end up saying, why don't we focus on this now and then do stage 2 and focus on that other part? So it's not only better for you as a solutions provider, but it also probably generates more revenue streams for you as well.
That's very interesting. Just quick pause, everyone. If you guys want to ask questions, we'll leave 10 minutes in the end, so you can do so, and you can leave them obviously in the chat. But coming back to the conversation, Pablo, another interesting thing about the way you go about projects is I know, and you told me you sometimes build teams of consultants for different projects since they're very varied. So I was wondering, how do you go about recruiting and actually coordinating these teams of consultants for specific projects?
Yeah, so something that's really important to know about that my approach as a generalist is really understanding that many times there is deeper technical knowledge that's beyond me. Now, I do my best to learn as much as I can about anything, but it's a disservice to a client to try to do something that's really outside your field. Now, I encourage anybody to to go outside their field. I think that that's important. But the best way to do that is oftentimes bringing others that do know more about it than you. So in terms of recruiting teams, I've used many different skills for recruiting, right? Like sometimes it's just the word of mouth network where you're trying to find people. We in my consulting practice, we have a core team that we add on people, subject matter specialists, or other people that we've worked with in the past. But it also, you know, I don't rule out something as simple as putting out solicitation on Fiverr or Upwork and trying to work with other people. But usually what I do is this exercise that my friend Jenny taught me, that basically whenever we onboard a new potential colleague, what we do is this thing called go get me a rock. Now, we don't tell that person that this is a go get me a rock exercise, but the way we do it is we onboard someone and we give them a task that is quite basic. It's dull. It's a rock. If the person can come back to you with just another rock that they picked up, that's great. You know that they can get it done. But if a person comes back with a really polished and shiny, great rock, then you know you've given them a chance and they've gone the extra mile and they've shown you that they really want to try hard, even if it's a very dull task. And so that's how, over the past, I've filtered out who we end up working with or not. Because I'm really less interested in knowing that someone has knowledge, but I'm way more interested in people that want to be part of teams and want to go the extra mile. And I have two rules when it comes to colleagues or teams, and one is integrity and the other one's initiative. Integrity takes a really long time to figure out, so you have to go on initiative at the beginning. And I make it a rule in my life to always correspond someone's initiative. If I get somebody's email and says, I'd really like to sit down and talk to you, they took the initiative to talk to me, and I'm definitely going to say yes.
Well, and thanks for that in this case, for coming on. Well, I have a lot of questions. I just want to make sure I'm respectful of everyone's time. So let me switch gears a little bit. What's your take on imposter syndrome? I think that's a very, very important topic when it comes to consulting and coming to a company or organization from the outside. And I think a lot of us struggle with that.
Yeah, you and I have had the opportunity a little bit to exchange some thoughts. I told you about my thoughts on imposter syndrome. The first thing that happens is you only have imposter syndrome if you're not an imposter, right? Like if you were an imposter, then you would know you're an imposter and it wouldn't affect you. But the real part behind it is that most people that work in consulting roles, because you come in and out of teams and you're surrounded by other people that are subject matter experts or have, you know, very, very deep expertise and lived experience in something, it can make you feel a little bit out of your depth. However, the first and most important thing that I think about dealing with that imposter syndrome is that when you're in the room as a consultant, people have already chosen to work with you. And there's a reason for that. And I think that we have to be really careful about not digging the ground from under our feet. So you may not actually know why you've been chosen. maybe you're actually chosen because you're an outsider and someone wants your creative thinking, or because you solved a different problem. So the first antidote to imposter syndrome is saying, I don't know, and naming the things you don't know. And when you're asked a question, just say, if you don't know, you don't know. And if you are speculating, say, I might be speculating, but based on my experience from this thing, I think this might be going on. And so you have to kind of build this, I guess, the structure around where you base your experience and your thoughts. That's one piece of it. The other piece I think is really important for all consultants, and I you know, this is a uncompensated plug for a book I didn't write, but if you haven't come across this book, it's a book called Range, and I really recommend it. It really talks about how creativity is born out of your ability to suppress self-criticism and self-doubt. And they give this great story in this book where the great musician Django Reinhardt told someone like, listen, don't tell me to play a C or an F, just play the note because I know it, but I just don't know how to read music. And if you think about that person, if he got to be one of the great musicians of the century without knowing how to read music, because at some point he decided that is not a barrier for expertise. That is just a formal structure. And that doesn't mean you can't develop expertise outside the formal structure. And I think that if I were to give anybody advice on dealing with imposter syndrome, I think it's something really worth keeping in mind, that sometimes we are our own worst enemies when it comes to our knowledge and what we bring to the table. And ultimately, from a sales standpoint, as a consultant, you have to sell everything with confidence. So, you know, there's two components for consultants with this. Now, I'm not saying, you know, if you start selling things you don't know how to do with a lot of confidence, you become the imposter. So it's only a matter of really trying to understand your core competencies. And I do think that most consultants are quite skilled about forming knowledge rather than performing knowledge. And ultimately, the imposter is performing knowledge, and the real asset to the problem at hand is forming knowledge. And as long as you're transparent with the things you currently have, don't have, even telling a client, I need to do my research on this, give me a week. Managing expectations is 80% of the battle.
For sure. And just a quick note, I can vouch for that book. I just recently finished it. And it's an amazing read for everybody listening. Well, I still have some questions, but I think I'll just open up to the audience, because if not, we could be here for hours. So what we can do is, if anyone has questions, feel free to chip in. And if not, we can go to the chat. So anyone, feel free.
Yeah, I'd like to ask Pablo, how was your coming to this consulting gig, and how did you learn eventually to sell yourself? Because it's not easy. We were talking about imposter syndrome, and at the beginning you kind of feel like, do I have my things straight? Am I going to be validated by, I don't know, some crowd that might be my niche? Could you tell us something a little bit of how you managed to pull those first gigs?
Yeah, I mean, I do think it's important to build a kind of, for your practice needs to build on success, right? You need to build on whatever you've gotten right in the past and be able to bring that to others and say, look what I've done here. I do think that it's really important from a business development standpoint, at least in my case. I think that the decision not to become too niche has been helpful, because I do think that in most of the cases, and I don't know if this is helpful to everyone, but in most of the cases where I find myself working, I do bring knowledge from other fields or other experiences, and that's what I offer the most, right? My pitch is not necessarily 20 years of experience in this one thing. My pitch is a bit of a 20 years of experience in this random walk across a bunch of things. And what I'm trying to bring to the table is not necessarily a solution that I already knew from something else. I'm trying to come up with something for you. And I do think that and that's why I think it's different for every consulting practice, because there's consulting practices that are quite specific, right? And in my case, because it is a generalist practice, what I bring to the table is an approach to problem solving, and this kind of integrating disciplines approach, right? So I like to jump different things, like different fields, and I use examples from many different disciplines as ways to demonstrate breadth, right? And that's why I do build multidisciplinary teams, because I'm the resident generalist, and sometimes I do need someone to be in the room with me, a resident specialist. And I do think that is a good way of approaching the issue of business development and selling yourself, because sometimes what I do end up having to sell is my ability to form multidisciplinary teams, and that means there's going to be a bunch of specialists and at least one generalist in the room. Yeah, thanks, Julian.
Cool. Any other questions from the audience?
I could jump in. Thanks a lot, Pablo. Really insightful. You mentioned managing expectations was like 80% of the gig. I'm really curious to just go a little bit deeper around, practical tips you've learned a lot along the way around managing expectations with clients.
Yeah, I do think that it's a huge aspect of our business in general, right? Every managing expectations happens at every aspect of the project. From the moment you sit down with somebody, you have to be quite careful never to overpromise and underdeliver. That's like the one thing that'll never get you called back, and it'll never get you another referral. I also think you shouldn't do the opposite. I don't think you should underpromise and overdeliver. I think you should. So managing expectations is about getting that project scoping just right, and being really upfront with your clients about time, effort, cost, especially when you're trying to scope something. You have to be transparent even about things like the opportunity cost of your time, right? So if someone wants you to be just on call all the time, you have to be transparent and say, if I do that, then I can't take any other business as a consultant, and that has a cost. And then people will usually step back and say, well, I don't want to have you full time. I just want you 3 days a week. And then you say, okay, well, this is what you get for 3 days a week, right? You're very upfront. And I think it takes a little getting used to, because most of those become uncomfortable conversations. I do think that it does become a recipe for success in the long run, because people trust exactly what you're giving them. And if you're doing the right scoping, then your projects aren't running over scope, and they're not costing customers more than what they thought. And they're actually going to be grateful and happy to get exactly what they hope to get for exactly the amount of time and exactly the price that they hope to pay. And if you have that no surprises approach with people, then they refer you to others. And I really do think it's a really hard thing to dial in up front. And the same goes for kind of deliverables along the way with the project. I think most clients are quite understanding when something happens. And if you're just transparent, I'll give you my case. I had a very big deliverable, but my dad was hospitalized for COVID. Now, I just called up my client. I said, look, this is happening. And frankly, I understand if you don't want to work with me, I'll find somebody else that can carry the rest of the project for you. But I don't think I'm going to get my mind back into this until I'm over this personal thing going on. But they were very understanding. And then they became actually a source of business in the future again. It didn't actually hamper my ability to keep working with the same counterparty. And I was actually terrified that they would think, so unprofessional, brought all this personal stuff. But ultimately, I think, that human approach and just being transparent makes people actually trust you more.
Amazing, thank you.
Thanks for that, Pablo. We're almost on time. I think we have one question in the chat. I don't know if it's too long, or maybe you can give a quick 1 minute version of a response, however you feel most comfortable.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, I do think around issues facing Endeavor companies, Endeavor is as diverse as the world is, and they're working in every single industry. So as a community, I do think getting closer to Endeavor works very well, but I think there has to be two levels to that strategy. The Landa community regionally, and then the recognition of the federated model for Endeavor, which is every country is kind of a standalone beast. And the best thing you can do is get close to the management of that country and get plugged into the events, because Endeavor is really a human network. So it wouldn't be that different from many other business development approaches. Just get close to the people.
Perfect.
Yeah. And if I can give like one more plug for the generalists out there, I don't think it's a detriment to your businesses to call yourself a generalist. I think that the world wants more experts, but there are plenty of experts.
Can I ask like one last thing? Do you think that generalist like way of work, right? Because it is very it is very common, that word, like right now. Do you think it depends on how big a company might be? Do you think a generalist might have like this environment where it feels that he's highly demanded, whereas in some other maybe higher or maybe bigger corporations, that might not be what they're looking for?
I think so. I